Amen. Well, hey, thank you for joining us. We're beginning a new series that will run for the next 3 weeks called 24. What a difference a day can make. And so this is about the resurrection and the difference that Jesus being raised from the dead can make. If you think about it, think back over your life, I'd like you to consider what are some of those key things that happened, those major events that happened from one day to the next where your life was transformed. Even this week, I'll give you some examples. Some of these can be incredibly positive. This week, we had a couple get engaged. Pretty big deal. We had another couple that had their first baby. Really big deal. Think back in your life, what were some of the major events that happened that were positive from one day to the next that had a significant impact in your life? We can have all kinds of those, but for those of us who are believers in Jesus Christ, certainly the day we placed our faith and trust in Jesus Christ was a life-changing, life-impacting day. But as we've had some positive days that have greatly impacted our life, for certain, we've had days that were painful. Days that were painful, disappointing, hurtful. Think back, if you would with me, to some of the events that literally changed your life that were painful or disappointing. If you're like me, you've made some choices along the way that you wish you had back. And some of those have been life-changing, have stayed with you. Disappointing, hurtful. Some of you have had things done to you, can't take back. And they've been incredibly painful and disappointing, hurtful. Some of you made bad decisions. Some of you have had some very hurtful things done to you. But what I want us to see in this, throughout this series, is that the resurrection is that which will really fuel our faith. As we look to the resurrection, it will continue to fuel our faith. What can happen is we can have a faith that's really on fire for the Lord, and we want to live our lives for the Lord. And events can happen that can dampen, sometimes almost feel like that fire has been put out. And so throughout this series, we're going to look at 3 different groups of people that kind of happened to them. They had what appears to be an on-fire faith or some sense of belief in Jesus. And then fallen world disappointment happened, and it put a damper on their faith. I'd like you to just there in your home answer this question. Can you think back to a time when you were more on fire for your faith? I see those hands. No, actually, I don't see those hands, but I suspect that many of you right now, as you're watching this, would go, yeah, I can refer back to a time in my life where I was far more on fire for the Lord, where I was actively involved in the local church and I was leading a small group, or I was part of a small group, or I was reading my Bible more regularly, or I was memorizing more scripture. Most of us can think back to times when we were more on fire for our faith than we are today. Now, if that's true, and I suspect it is for a very large number of those who would be listening today, then what is it that's happened that has caused a damper on what was a once on fire faith? I would like to suggest to you, and I think we'll see this as we walk through the scriptures this morning, that we go through what I'm describing as fallen world, life-disappointing events that cause us to have our faith that was once so on fire be dampened. A fire that once wanted to live so zealously and just fully devoted to the Lord now has become dampened. And I'd like to suggest to you that that's because in a fallen world, we experience disappointment. All of us. Some of you right now are facing some tragedy, some difficulties. Some things have happened to you. And you find that this faith that once was so strong and so on fire right now has waned a bit and feels as if it's been dampened some. And so what I wanted us to do this morning is walk through this and see how The reality of the resurrection is that which will refuel our faith. I want to begin with a passage in Luke chapter 7, and I'll tell you why I'm starting here. The passage that I really want to begin with begins with this phrase, after this, but you won't know what was before that unless we read it. So after I read this story, it's going to say after this, and then we'll be into our passage. In Luke 7, verse 36, it says, when one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and he reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet, she was weeping. She began to wash his feet, wet his feet with her tears. She wiped them with her hair and kissed them, poured perfume on them. The Pharisee who had invited him saw this. He said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she's a sinner. And Jesus answers him and says, Simon, I have something to tell you. Boy, did he ever have something to tell him. He says, tell me, teacher. So Jesus says, two people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. We believe a denarii was about a day's worth of wage. So one owed 50, one owed 500. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which one of them will love him more? Well, Simon replies, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. And Jesus said, bingo. No, he didn't say bingo. He said, you have judged correctly. Then he turns, interestingly enough, towards the woman as he says to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. So then he says to her, your sins are forgiven. And some there began to kind of mutter under their breath, who is this that can forgive sins? Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go on in peace. I think it's significant that that story precedes the passage that we're going to look at today and begin with. Think about this. You had what was a seemingly religious guy, a Pharisee, self-righteous nonetheless, but in their day seemingly righteous, being contrasted with a woman who is well known to be sinful. That was her lifestyle, a sinful lifestyle. It was Simon who has invited Jesus as his personal dinner guest, and the woman, at least from Simon's perspective, is not only uninvited, but is an intrusion. This was pretty common for women in that day. They were subjugated, were treated with a lot of respect. What Jesus does, it's fascinating, but as this woman humbles herself, recognizes the transformation Jesus can bring to her life, and she just expresses so much gratitude. In a sense, Jesus elevates this woman in our story as he humiliates almost this guy. Jesus lifts up the humble. He exalts the humble, but the proud, he takes them down. And so when you read this story, you see a woman in a culture where they're incredibly subjugated, and the Lord is lifting her up, and you see this woman's faith you talk about an on-fire faith. This woman's faith and the way she expressed it, just complete, extravagant, unabandoned, outlandish, radical worship of the Lord. And some of you can remember back to a time when that was kind of like where your faith was. You were almost like when you first came to know the Lord, you couldn't help, you were telling everybody about it. And now you find yourself at a place where you would maybe hardly share. Well, let me begin in our passage for today that kind of sets up where we're going to go. It says, after this, in other words, after this encounter with the Pharisee and the woman, after this, Jesus traveled from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. Then there's these few words, just 5 words, the 12 were with him. And then it says this, also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. There's Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. There's Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household. Susanna, and many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. I was fascinated when I read this at the amount of press that were given to the 12. It just says the 12 were with him. The 12 were with him. But then it goes on to describe these women in detail and how they were helping Jesus. And I couldn't help but find myself thinking back to the story that preceded this. There was a woman whose faith was incredibly on fire because she had been cured from that which she was contaminated, her sinful life. And you have the same thing here again. All these women have been cured. And I put it this way, that an on-fire faith occurs when we go from contaminated to cured. Think back to when you came to know the Lord. All of us were plagued with sin. We had the sin virus, and Jesus is the cure. And when we placed our faith and trust in Jesus, we encountered freedom from bondage, and we went from death to life and from darkness to light. And so these women in this story all encountered that. Let me read this little section again. The 12 were with him, and then Luke 2 and 3 say, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases, Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household, Susanna, and many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. I find this incredible. I want to share just a few observations. If you think with me about this passage, it seems like every one of these women were either diseased or demon-possessed or both. It says some women who have been cured of evil spirits and diseases. So at one point, their lives were held captive by sickness, sin, or demon possession, but now they've been set free. And it appears from this passage that it was through the ministry of Jesus they have been set free, because they've committed their lives now to leaving an old lifestyle and following and helping Jesus and company advance the cause of Christ. Now, if you're wondering whether or not these women are on fire for Jesus, it's obvious. There's an obvious transformation of heart, and it's evidenced by their willingness to both physically and financially contribute to the continual cause and work of Jesus. The last line of this passage in Luke 8:3 says these women were helping to support them out of their own means. What a testimony! Because women in this culture were incredibly subjugated and many times struggled to make ends meet. One of the things that's fascinating is when God gets your heart, he gets all of you, and your time is devoted to the Lord. Your energy and your thinking is devoted to the Lord. But another aspect of that is our finances. We always see this in the scriptures. When people's hearts are turned to the Lord, their finances are one of those things that people generously and freely give to keep the work of God. I want to share with you, I don't know what other churches' experience are right now, local churches, but I can share with you from the pastoral staff and from the elders' perspective, we've been incredibly blessed here through this coronavirus as we're doing live streaming and online. We have people calling, emailing, texting, with an eagerness to continue to give of their gifts and offerings so that the work of God can continue. I think that's such a cool thing. In our story today, imagine this. In a culture where women are incredibly subjugated and many struggled to make ends meet, they were taking of their own resources to keep the cause of Christ going. Now, why were they doing that? Because their own lives were so significantly impacted by Jesus. Now, think about this. Are they, on a scale of 1 to 10, just knowing what you've heard so far, how on fire are these women? Pretty on fire for Jesus. What I'd like to do is just real quick, I want to kind of introduce you a little more personally to them. Mary Magdalene, we'll bring up a map. Hopefully you can see this map, and you'll see at the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee, there's a place called Magdala, or it's also called Magadan. And this is where Mary gets her name. Mary was from this region. A couple weeks ago in a series called Answer the Call, you were on call. I read a passage from Matthew 9, and I want to read it to you real quick. Because I think Mary Magdalene was probably a part of this story. Matthew 9, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. They saw the crowd, they had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And he says to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. It's likely that Mary from Magdala, was one of those who Jesus healed, and now she comes on board as a worker for Jesus and giving of her own means to help advance the cause. Mary was a walking miracle. According to this passage, she was filled with 7 demons. And honestly, it's hard for us to know what are demons. You know, what's a demon? Is lust a demon? Is greed a demon? Is selfishness a demon? Or are these simply things that have not yet been surrendered to the Lord, and we call them a demon? It's hard to know. It really is hard for us. Some people say, well, depression, that's my demon. Here's what we know. We know when Jesus comes in, demons go out. We know that. And I'm not sure all of us in some ways wrestle with our demons, I suppose. Mary had 7 demons, and she had been cured from those. She became a new person, new outlook, new life, new freedom, and certainly an on-fire faith. The next woman mentions Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household. This is amazing. Joanna is the wife of Chuza, who is the manager of Herod Antipas's household. Herod Antipas is the ruling authority. He's called the Tetrarch of Galilee. A tetrarch is simply a term for a fourth part. Herod Antipas's father was Herod the Great. Do you remember when Jesus was born, there was a Herod who was outraged? That was Herod the Great. That same Herod initiated genocide of all the babies 2 years old and younger in Bethlehem and in the nearing vicinity to try to wipe out Jesus. This is his son who's ruling in Galilee, and his manager's wife is healed from some sickness or demon and chooses, it seems, to leave that lifestyle and follow Christ. And not only to leave that lifestyle and to follow Christ, but to give of her resources to help advance the cause of Christ. So you have Mary Magdalene, you have this incredible story about Joanna, who has also given her life, and then there's a woman named Susanna, and then it says, and many others. So these women's lives have been radically changed, and their faith is on fire, because we read this line in Luke 8:3, these women were helping to support them out of their own means. Do you see how on fire these women were for Jesus? And they get to walk with him day in, day out, and watch Jesus do amazing things, change lives just like their lives were changed. I wonder how many of you can relate at this point of the story and go, man, I can remember a time where I was just like them. I said, Lord, whatever, wherever, whenever, I'm going to follow you. You can remember when you were more bold in your faith. You can remember when you were plugged in a local church and serving. And what happened? What happened? Some of you are thinking back when he used to change your thinking and your living and your speech, and now you're using profanity like it's nothing, and you hardly pay any attention to local church, what God is doing through the local church. You ever wish sometimes you'd be as on fire as you once were with God? You ever wonder what happened? What caused me to lose that on fire faith? Think about these women in this story. At this stage of their journey, they are about as on fire as you can get, leaving their old lifestyle because Jesus changed them, following him wherever he went, and giving of their resources so the work of God could continue. Well, sometimes disappointments from this fallen world can happen. Things don't go the way we'd expect them to. Some of our dreams don't come true. In fact, sometimes they're just shattered. Sometimes things that are hurtful happen to us, and sometimes we do things that are hurtful. These women have had a front row seat to watching Jesus do amazing things. And we're on about as fire for Jesus as anybody could be. Remember, I told you that life in a fallen world can sometimes dampen our on-fire faith for God? Imagine being these women, and in less than a 24-hour day, everything that you thought was shattered. These women actually followed Jesus to a hillside called Golgotha. And they had watched this miracle worker, the one that had transformed their lives, be mocked and spit upon. They watched him be beaten, and they watched him placed on a cross between two well-known criminals. Can you imagine the confusion? The agony in their soul. What in the world is happening, God? And their on-fire faith for Jesus that caused them to follow Jesus all the way to Golgotha, no doubt had put a damper on that on-fire faith for God. Fallen world disappointments can do that. I just the past 2 weeks, I've been in conversation with different sheep from Stillwater, and the coronavirus has done that. Some sheep have expressed how going through this fallen world disappointment has changed the trajectory in a negative way in their walk with God. That's not the case for everybody. For some, it's deepened their faith. We'll talk about that in a moment. But for many, fallen world disappointments can dampen our faith. What are some of the fallen world disappointments that have happened to you that have caused your faith to be dampened? These women watched the crucifixion. It says in Matthew, many women were there watching from a distance, and they had followed Jesus from Galilee. So they had followed Jesus 80 miles, had been tracking with him, helping care for his needs, it says. And then it lists them. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Joseph, the Mary of Zebedee's sons. Mark recounts this too. Says, Mark 15:40 says, some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome, which would have been James and John's mom. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. So this story is about these women that are following Jesus because of the life transformation and healing he brought into their world. And there they are at a distance watching Jesus on a cross. What happens later that day is a guy by the name of Joseph of Arimathea. This is recorded in John 19. Asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Joseph was a disciple of Jesus. Secretly, he feared the Jewish leaders. He was a part of the Sanhedrin, the 72 that ruled for the Jews. He was accompanied by Nicodemus. Interestingly enough, he had met with Jesus in private, John chapter 3, also from the Sanhedrin. So at least two of these guys from the Sanhedrin, 72, were believing in Jesus. It says he was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. That's recorded, in John 3. Nicodemus brought myrrh, aloes, and about 75 pounds. They took Jesus' body. Two of them wrapped it, spices, linen. It was according to the Jewish burial custom. At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden. In the garden, a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid, because it was the Jewish day of Passover, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus' body in this tomb. Well, here's what's significant about this. Luke picks up on this, and it says this in Luke 23. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee, look what they did. They followed Joseph, and they saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. I can't imagine what must have been running through their minds and through their hearts, and the disappointment and the pain and the hurt that they must have been experiencing in that moment. It says, then they went home, and get this line. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes. They rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. Now, I want you to think with me about this. These women that trekked with Jesus were so on fire that they were giving of the resources and advancing his cause. Now watch him be mocked, bitten, beaten, made fun of, and hung between two criminals. Then they watched Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus take this body and wrap it in 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes and perfume, and they're literally watching this body be placed in a tomb. But this line, I want you to think with me. They went home and prepared spices and perfume. Why would they do that? Why would they go home and prepare spices and perfume? They wanted to use those on Jesus' dead body, right? They were preparing spices and perfume for a dead body. Now, I just want you to let that sink in, because this is the place in your journey where some of you find yourself today. You are unbelievably ridden with pain and hurt, some of which you did to yourself, and some of what happened to you just living in a fallen world. But you find yourself at a place where your dreams are shattered, your hopes are shattered, and you look at the life that you could have had and you screwed up, or somebody else screwed up, and it leaves you unbelievably ridden with pain and hurt. Disappointment will do that. The disappointment of a fallen world will certainly put a dampen on your once on fire faith. It happens. And so here they are, leaving this tomb where they literally saw the body of Jesus laid. They go home and they begin to prepare their spices and their perfume for when they can go back to the dead body. I want to pick up there. John is writing about this, and interestingly enough, if you were to study this account, it's in all four Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all record the account of resurrection morning. And each one gives it from a different perspective, so it's very hard to put all the pieces together. It really is. There's one angel, and then one time there's two angels, and John says it's Mary Magdalene. The other Gospels say that there were other women there. They go back, they talk to the disciples. Peter and John run to the tomb. Then they go back and talk again. So it's very fragmented. I want to walk you through a combination of the pieces to give you some of the significance that's related to our part of the story. John's account, John chapter 20, verse 1 says, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. And John is highlighting Mary Magdalene's story, I believe, because everything that was written in John is to call people to believe that Jesus is the Christ, Son of the living God, and by believing you'll have life in his name. And being the purpose of John, he's highlighting Mary Magdalene. Here's her story. Well, Mark mentions that when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. This is in Mark. And it says it was very early, the first day of the week after sunrise. They were on their way to the tomb. And on the way, they're saying, who's going to roll the stone away? And then they look up and the stone's gone. Matthew's account of this tells you that there was an earthquake. So when they got there, the stone had already been rolled away. And the guards were standing there aghast, as if they were almost dead, in shock. All the writers are reason for writing for different purposes. Luke's account is interesting. It says, when Mary Magdalene and Joanna, Mary and mother of James, and the 11 others with them who told this to the apostles, they did not believe. So when they came back from the tomb, they told this to the 11. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and others with them. All these women. So here it's giving a large account of women. And it says they go back and they told the apostles, but get this line. They did not believe the women because their words seemed like nonsense. Women just weren't given a whole lot of credibility in what they had to say. Isn't it fascinating that that's who Jesus had first at the resurrection? Fascinating. Well, so we read in John 1 that Mary Magdalene was there and saw the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed. And then John continues, he says, so she came running back to Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. We believe that to be John. And she said, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they've put him. In other words, she's thinking somebody stole his dead body. Peter outran the disciples, started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter. John was a little faster. He had taken track in Jerusalem. And so he reaches the tomb first. John bends over and looks in at the stripes of linen there, but did not go in. Then it says Pete came alongside him and went straight into the tomb. We'll talk about this more next week. And he saw the stripes of linen lying there, as well as the cloth had been wrapped around Jesus' head. Cloth still lying in place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, John, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside, saw and believed. Then it says they still did not understand from the scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. So Mary, now back at the tomb again, and with other women, but John's recording it this way. John says, Mary stood outside the tomb, and she wept. She bent over to look into the tomb. She saw two angels in white, seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head, one at the feet. And they ask her, so the angels are asking her, woman, why are you crying? And here's her response. The same response that she had just told the disciples. They have taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they've put him. Second time she said that. At this, she turns around and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't realize it was Jesus. And he asked her the same question the angels asked her, why are you crying? Same response. She says to him, thinking he's a gardener, sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him, I'll get him. She wants to see the dead body. And Jesus says to her in this moment, and this is the difference a day can make in your life, a moment in your life. Even today, this message can make in your life. Jesus says to her, Mary, and she turned towards him and cried out in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. In that moment, she recognized that Christ was raised from the dead. Jesus says to her, don't hold on to me, for I've not yet ascended to the Father, but go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and to your God. And Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, and I would have liked to have seen this moment. The difference the Lord can make in a moment. She says, I have seen the Lord. And she told them that he had said these things to her. And I want to share with you this morning, nothing fuels the fire of your faith like the reality of the resurrection for Jesus. Nothing will fuel your faith your on-fire faith like the reality of the resurrection. So if the coronavirus or some other fallen world disappointment has caused you to lose that what was on-fire faith for God, let me remind you of what took place on the resurrection. While those ladies went, and while they witnessed the cross, and while they witnessed the tomb, Jesus showed himself to them alive. And what a difference a day can make in your life. If you would just reset your eyes and your heart on the resurrected Christ. Let me remind you that he has conquered sin, and he's conquered Satan. He's conquered death, and he's conquered hell. And that you are no longer, if you're a follower of Jesus, you are not a slave to sin. He has set you free so that you can be a slave to righteousness, to do the right thing. And that through Jesus, we are more than conquerors. Some of you have allowed life in a fallen world to dampen your once on fire faith for God. This passage, through these women, we are encouraged to have a renewed on fire faith for God, to let our faith be fueled and refueled by the reality of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That we have hope during this coronavirus like nobody else is business. Like nobody can understand the hope that a follower of Jesus Christ has, even in the midst of a coronavirus. From an earthly perspective, the worst thing that could happen to us is death, and that is just new life. Do not fear. And don't let the fallen world disappointments that happen to you, whether it's medical news or a spouse who's cheated on you or something foolish that you have done, don't let it dampen your on-fire faith for God. Just a few quick takeaways. I find it fascinating and interesting in a culture where women were consistently subjugated, the Lord persistently elevated. He did. He kept elevating them, showing the value, showing the worth. But I want you to notice in the story, it's he who did the elevating. We're called to take the position where he must increase, we must decrease. It's in that place where he elevates, where he exalts. He exalts the humble. He takes down the proud. Second takeaway, no matter how on fire you are in your faith, based on all the amazing things that God has done in your past, sometimes the present fallen world disappointments can take their toll. And we need to be reminded of the reality of what took place on the resurrection. Some of you need to be reminded. Some of you need to be reminded that he conquered the grave, and in as 24 hours, everything changed. What a difference a day can make. Some of you, this is an opportunity for you to place your faith and trust in Jesus. You've been trying for so long to make life work without God, or your form of God, making him fit what you want him to look like so that you can still live the way you want to live. And today, maybe the reality of that is hitting home, and the fallen world disappointments are catching up with you, and you're realizing that there's not life apart from the resurrection and what Jesus did. For you, I would encourage you to quit trying to make life work without God. Start trusting that life can only work as you believe in God. For the rest of you who've allowed this disappointments in a fallen world to somehow take its toll and dampen your once on fire for faith, I just want to encourage you to confess that has happened. Tell God, God, I realize here's what's happened. I have let the disappointment, hurt, heartache from living in a fallen world dampen my on-fire faith for you. Confess it to him. Forgive. Ask for his forgiveness. And then press in. You say here a lot, cling to the vine. Apart from him, you can't do anything. And press fresh back into your Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Will you bow your heads with me in prayer?